Now, the poet, actor and writer Benjamin Zephaniah has died at the age of 65. He'd been diagnosed with a brain tumour 8 weeks ago. His family described him as a true pioneer and innovator. Well, remember this.
I used to think nurses were women. I used to think police were men. I used to think poets were boring until I became one of them.
Fabulous stuff. Let's talk now to the host of BBC Radio 1 Extra's talk show, 1 Extra Talks, Richie Brave, who joins me live on the programme. Richie, thank you for being here. Just in terms of your initial reaction, because I know you met him, your work, his work, so often entwined, didn't they?
Yeah, I mean, such an honour to be here and speak about one of the giants from our community. I mean, Benjamin Zephaniah was an uncle to so many of us, and I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was a small child. So this speaks to his activism work and community focus. He came and did performances for us in South London as children, and I also met him at several events as an adult, and he always had time to stop and speak to people. He was just such a ball of love.
It's so interesting watching you and listening to you, because as you were starting that, you were smiling because you were remembering him. And I heard Lemsey say, the great poet, he was on Radio 4 earlier, exactly the same thing with him. I mean, he was saying that Lemsey was describing how contrary he was, an activist, how loving, how angry. Do you think those were some of the reasons he cut through, made such an impact?
I mean, absolutely. What's so important to remember, like you said, he wasn't just a poet. He was a proud Rasta man. He was a pioneer. He was a symbol of Black resistance for a lot of Black British people across the country. He was also an animal rights activist. Also, he was dyslexic. I mean, he left school at 13 years of age, being unable to read or write. And then he became one of our most seasoned and most celebrated poets. I think one of the reasons why he cut through was just his authenticity and tenacity. I mean, Benjamin Zephaniah was someone who critiqued the legal system. He was vocal about racism. He wrote Rasta Time in Palestine in 1990 following his visit. He refused an MBE. I mean, he was someone who stood in his integrity and authenticity in every opportunity he could.
I'll come back to the subject matter of so much of his writings in a moment, but you told our producer, when people become famous, they can put up barriers between them and their communities. Benjamin worked to make sure those barriers never existed in the first place.
I mean, Benjamin went into writing because he wanted to take away the dead image of poetry. And I don't think we realize, or we always realize, just how big Benjamin was. Because when you met him, it felt like meeting a family member. Our very own Alice Bandukravi tweeted a bit earlier on around her first meeting with him and him taking her out to lunch and making her feel so at home. I mean, Benjamin was a people person. He was a community person. But that doesn't take away from just how amazing he was and is, and his legacy.
Tell me more about his subject matter. I was just looking at some of his interviews in the past. I was amused by one he gave to Channel 4, where he said, I'm an anarchist, I'd like to have a revolution, but everyone is too busy shopping. that was absolutely classic him. But in terms of the broader subject matter, I mean, there was some pretty tough stuff. He quite often returned, didn't he, to being Black and British and what life was like, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't remove your Black identity from your British identity. And also, he was a descendant of a Bayesian parent and a Jamaican parent, and also a proud person from Birmingham as well. So he was in Peaky Blinders as well. I mean, if you look at him historically, Benjamin had a very hard time, and he was very honest about the hard time he had. He spoke so much about racism, not just because of his own experiences, but just his desire and love for his community and want for them not to have to go through the very same things he went through earlier on in his life.
There was also so much fun, wasn't there, in his writing? One remembers talking turkeys and, you know, the connection he had with so many young people and children. Now, you mentioned turning down an OBE. It wasn't just the empire word in the OBE that sort of was behind that. You know, he talked about them making the point it was his contribution to literature, but he said, you know, what about my contribution to animal rights? What about my contribution to writing to prisoners? All the things he was really so desperate to be involved with.
Yeah, and he wasn't a one-dimensional person. And again, I think it comes back to what I said a bit earlier on, his authenticity and his tenacity. He wasn't somebody to be boxed, and his writing was a tool for him to be able to speak about his activism and vice versa. They both informed each other. So for Benjamin, I mean, he spoke directly about, I've spent my whole life fighting the empire or critiquing the empire. Why would I want to be branded with it? And I think for a lot of us in Black Britain, it was something that we looked to and we could identify with.
Do you think he gets the literary recognition he deserves?
No, I never do. I just think for us, I mean, if you look at the Black community, Black British community, specifically Black Caribbean communities, when it comes to poetry, poetry isn't just the ways in which we write and recite words. It's embedded in our culture, in our art, in our music, in sound system culture, which he was very much part of. I think for somebody like him, it isn't just recognition for his poetry, but it's his recognition for legacy and impact that he's had on wider communities, and not just the Black British community, which has been immeasurable, but just the wider world community and animals. He was an animal rights activist, and I don't think many people know that about him.
Richie Brave, we have to leave it there, but thanks for your wonderful tribute. You've done him proud. Thanks for joining us here on BBC News and our programme.
Thank you.